click us through. And we did a cool piece of work back in 2020 where we saved all that food, and we did the kind of amazing audits, and we did a grazing platter with a chef from food that was all in the rubbish. We get a bit stuck on getting it through. Yep. Oh, we've gone too far. I'll just go.
You can do my bit if you like.
Yeah. Maybe if you go back. Yep. And yep. So yep, there we were. That was some of the meat that we pulled out, and it was pretty disgusting. We'll go to the next one, thanks. And so that kind of culminated in an LTP business case for consideration in 2020, and you saw me coming to speak to that. We didn't get that into the LTP, but from that we've secured some funding via Gary to progress this a little bit further, so we have more information and more data, so we have more surety about what food waste collection could look like for Waipa, how much that could cost and all that kind of thing. And so that's how we engaged with Eunomia. And since we started this process, the government has announced plans that councils with access to existing composting infrastructure, including Waipa, within 150 kilometres, and they have listed us under that category, that they are proposing that we would be one of the councils to have a food waste collection service within 2 years. So that's kind of like caught us up and overtaken us, but that is still under consultation, which we fed back on that was not a realistic timeframe. But just that's the kind of context. But I'll just pass over to Lisa, and I'll let Duncan take my spot, and if there's any questions I'll be just there.
Is this not working at all?
I don't think it's working.
Okay. Right. Good morning, everybody. So as Sally said, my name is Lisa. I work with Eunomia Research and Consulting, and this is Duncan. Also with Eunomia, we are a specialist waste management consultancy, and Sally's brought us on board to help you with the investigations around introducing a food waste collection and what that might mean. So I'm going to try, oh, it's working now. It was just you, Sally, didn't like you. So we do have an hour, but I know you guys are running a little bit behind time. So normally we'd be happy to take questions on the way through, but I think we might just see how we go. And if we're getting a little bit too wrapped up in a particular issue, then we might need to just move on. So just to give you a quick rundown on what we're going to be talking about this morning, I'm going to take you through what I call Organic Waste 101. And this is just intended to make sure that everybody has got the same level of understanding of some key waste issues, why it is that organic waste is a particular concern, and why we might be looking at a food waste collection in the first place. I'm going to talk you through the Waipa waste context, which hopefully you should be pretty familiar with already, and also just to bring you up to speed on a number of things that are happening nationally, because there is a lot going on. And then I will hand over to Duncan, who's our analysis superhero, and he's going to talk you through the different options that we've looked at for you, and just to talk about how that whole modelling process works. So when I talk to any group about waste, there's two key principles that I like to make sure everybody's kind of got forefront in their minds, because if you can understand these two key concepts, then really pretty much everything else follows along logically after that. So the first of those two principles is what we call the waste hierarchy, which is what's showing up on the screen. And the waste hierarchy is something that's quite central to the way waste is managed in New Zealand. The idea of this hierarchy is that it's a really simple but quite elegant tool which enables us to make decisions. And the idea is that taking action towards the top of the hierarchy, which is looking at preventing waste or reducing waste, is going to be lower cost, and it's going to have a greater impact than the actions at the bottom of the hierarchy. And at the bottom, we have options like landfilling and waste incineration. So as we're thinking about the options that we've got to manage waste, if we can see that something sits towards the top of the hierarchy, then we know intuitively that's going to be a preferable option than one that sits further down the list. So the other thing that I like to explain is just to make sure everybody's really clear what a landfill actually is. Because what I find when I sit down with groups is that a lot of people have this view of a landfill as being essentially a large compost heap. So for them, it doesn't really matter whether you're sending organic waste to a landfill or if you're doing something else with it, because it kind of has the same outcome at the end of the day. And this is actually really quite far from the truth. So what you can see up on that diagram is essentially what a modern landfill looks like in New Zealand. So just to be clear, we're not talking about the legacy landfills like the old landfill on the Fox River that busted open and we ended up with rubbish everywhere. Since the RMA and other environmental controls, this is what landfills look like in New Zealand. So this is the kind of facility that Waipa's waste is going to at the moment. So in the bottom of the landfill, you have a liner, which is waterproof, and then the waste is put into the landfill, it's compacted, and then it's covered over the top. And what this means is that inside the landfill, there is very little oxygen, and that changes the way things break down inside the landfill, means that they break down anaerobically without oxygen. And the main gas that is produced is methane, because it's very hard to make CO2 when you don't have any of the O. So this is the gas that comes out of landfills like the site that Waipa's waste goes to. And in many of these landfills, that gas, that methane, is captured and it does go to beneficial use, say potentially being turned into electricity. But what we know is that not all of the gas is captured. It can vary quite significantly, and figures might range between maybe 55 to 65%. The generally accepted number in New Zealand is, I think, around 65%. The other byproduct that comes out of a landfill is liquid stuff. So this is all of the chemicals and the liquids that leach out of the waste, and that gets captured by that liner and usually gets sent to some sort of waste treatment plant. So this is where Waipa's organic waste is going at the moment through means such as curbside rubbish collections. The alternative, particularly for organic waste, is an actual compost process. And because a composting process has lots of oxygen in it, the process is completely different and the outputs are completely different. So when we put organic waste into a composting process, you end up with some gases, but those gases are things like CO2 rather than methane. And mostly you end up with a beneficial soil product or compost. So any questions on that one? Great. So this is one of the reasons why when we focus on taking specific types of waste out of landfills, it's the organic waste that we will often focus on, because that is the source of the methane. So just moving on to the Waipa context and why we're here today. So the question of food waste collections was first raised in your Waste Management and Minimisation Plan, which is your statutory planning document for waste, the one plan to rule them all, we like to say. And included in that is an action plan which mentions actions relating to food waste several times. Supporting your WMMP is something called a waste assessment. And this is a long technical document that pulls together all of the facts and figures that you have access to relating to waste in your district. And the idea of pulling together all of this information is to enable you to identify what your key issues are. And food waste going to landfill was identified as being one of your key issues that needs to be managed. Supporting the waste assessment, and one of the sources of the information that we use in the waste assessment are audits. So someone, as Sally mentioned, actually goes out onto the curbside, sorts through all of those rubbish bags and bins, and actually works out what is being put out on the curbside, particularly by householders. And what was found when curbside rubbish was analysed for Waipa is that between 37 and 40% of your household curbside rubbish containers is food waste. So this makes it quite clear that this is going to be quite a key issue for managing waste in Waipa. Just To give you a little bit more detail on those figures, the audit found that on average 3.4 kilos of food waste was being thrown out per household per week. But interestingly, we see this vary quite a lot between households. So households that use bags for their rubbish collections put out less food waste, and households that have large bins for their rubbish collections put out more. And you can see on the table there the differences between households that use bags and households that use wheelie bins. And you might think, well, that makes perfect sense, because a household that uses a large wheelie bin will be a larger household, and so they will have more rubbish to throw out. But what we find consistently, and this is not just in Waipa, this is throughout New Zealand, is that households that have large wheelie bins fill them up. And they fill them up not just with food waste, they fill them up with recyclables, they fill them up with garden waste. And so it's not necessarily a matter of needing the extra space, but they have the extra space and so they use it. We got any questions about those numbers before I move on to the national context? Great. So as I mentioned earlier, in the last 5 years, central government has been extremely busy, and they've given councils and they've given the waste industry in general a lot to do. So I'm just going to run through some of the key changes and the key projects that government has been working on, particularly relating to food waste. So one of the first things that happened was they decided that they were going to increase and expand the landfill levy. So instead of the landfill levy only applying to what we call class 1 landfills, which are the types of landfills that your household rubbish goes to, the landfill levy now applies to 4 out of the 5 different classes of landfills that we have in New Zealand. And as well as expanding the landfill levy, they've also increased it. So the landfill levy has already increased for class 1 landfills, and it has been introduced for a couple of other landfills, and those rates are going to increase to definitely to July 2024. And we will probably, but we can't guarantee because none of us have a crystal ball with us, we are probably going to be seeing further increases after that point. So yeah, good question. So the landfill levy is a per tonne charge. So pretty much all landfills in New Zealand have weighbridges, and the rubbish will get weighed as it goes into the landfill, and the levy gets paid per tonne. So you started off at $10 per tonne, and by July 2024 for a class 1 landfill, that's going to go up to $60 per tonne. And the landfill levy income gets returned to government. 50% of it comes back to councils, and that's based on a population basis. And 50% of it, less a little bit, goes to the Waste Minimisation Fund. So the other policy which has quite a significant impact on how much it costs us to send waste to landfill is the emissions trading scheme. And this sets the idea of having a carbon price, and the price for a emissions trading scheme unit, as they're known, is currently over $80. And it's gone up significantly in the last few years, and everybody is forecasting that it is going to increase more. So alongside these two quite big changes, we've got a whole load of other projects that the ministry is working on. The emissions reduction plan came out quite recently for consultation, and this is aiming to implement the recommendations that came out of the Climate Change Commission's work. And particularly important for our discussion this morning, the emissions reduction plan is potentially looking at banning organic waste going to landfill completely or in some form. And the reason they're doing this is because of what we talked about earlier. Organic waste going into landfill produces methane, and this is the main source of greenhouse gas emissions from the waste sector in New Zealand. Another consultation that came out quite recently, which is actually now closed, and we're now waiting to find out what the ministry is going to do with the, how many? 3,000 submissions that they received. They had an enormous number of submissions. The two main proposals that are relevant for today is that the ministry is talking about curbside standardisation. And as part of curbside standardisation, they're not just looking at recycling collections, they're also looking at requiring every district or city in New Zealand to have a household curbside food waste collection. So obviously we don't know exactly what's going to come out of the consultation process, but as Sally highlighted, that is, if it comes in, likely to be implemented in a staged process. And so they're going to look at the councils that would be able to implement it faster, and they will focus on those first. There were also suggestions in that consultation document that potentially a food waste collection for businesses may be required.
So is there any indication, is that going to just be carte blanche through the country, or is rural folks going to be different here? I mean, a lot of rural folks get rid of their pigs, chickens, animals.
For sure, yeah. Great question. So the proposed requirement at the moment is for urban households, and exactly how you define an urban household is up for question, but you can assume that if a household is being provided a curbside recycling collection, then government's likely to require them to be provided a food waste collection also. So other proposals that they've been consulting on recently, the container return scheme, which came out at the same time as curbside standardisation. They're also looking at building on some work that we actually did for the ministry last year, doing a stock take of all waste infrastructure across the country, and they're looking at an investment strategy as to how they might fill some of those gaps. And they also continue to name priority products, which means that, for example, a product stewardship scheme may need to be developed for those products. So just finishing off, I think this is getting towards the end of the list. There is a lot. They're also looking at revising the Waste Minimisation Act. That may involve bringing in some national requirements around waste data, which is always a problem in the sector. They're currently working on data reporting, particularly for transfer stations and the landfills that now pay the landfill levy. There's work being done on recyclability labelling, national environmental standards for new materials, and work being done on how to manage hazardous waste. And they're also expanding their teams that look at compliance and with regulations and just monitoring that compliance generally. So this is where I hand over to Duncan. So if you've got any questions about any of that, feel free to ask them now. Otherwise, we'll jump into the curbside side of things.
I think keep going, and we'll pick up the questions at the discussions towards the end.
That's very
cool. Thank you. So good afternoon, everyone, and thanks, Lisa, for that introduction. So what I'm going to do is just take you through the foundations of the work that we've been commissioned to do, and that is looking at the collection systems that you've got in place, and what introducing a food waste service might actually look like, and what kind of and level of service might actually be appropriate, and what kind of performance you might be able to get out of introducing a food waste collection service. So before we kind of get into the actual food waste collection service itself, it's worth starting with the basic principle that any collection system operates as part of a wider kind of ecosystem of collections, and so each type of service influences the other types of services that might be in place. So, for example, if you've got a rubbish collection system where everyone's got a large 240 litre wheel bin, like Lisa says, where it's it's there and it's big and it's easy and it's convenient and people chuck stuff in it, that means people are less likely to use the recycling system or the organic system. So each of those things tends to influence the other things that you've got in place. And there's also been work to show that if you've got things like food waste collection systems, that will potentially increase people's engagement with your recycling systems and so forth as well. So you need to kind of think of things as a whole, essentially. And the key principle in terms of how you design those systems is that the lower costs and the more convenient services, the more that people use it. That sounds really kind of obvious and really basic, but it's amazing how often people design services without really thinking about those basic kind of human interactions. So if you want to design a service that you want people to use, then you need to, and Lisa had the waste hierarchy there before. Cool, thank you. And if you want to encourage people to use services that are higher up the waste hierarchy, then you need to make those services cheaper, more convenient, easier, and pleasant for the householders to engage with. So they need to be economical, they need to be efficient, they need to be safe, and you need to make sure that the system works as a whole, so that you're not doing something in one system that impacts on parts of the other system. Like, for example, if you collect food waste, you need to make sure you've got adequate processing facility in place to do that within good proximity, and all of those things. And also the last point there, just that savings in one part can often result in costs on another part of the service. So, for example, if you think, well, we don't want to give householders the gold-plated service, we'll give them, we'll just give them a curbside bin. We won't give them a kitchen container, for example. That might save you money there, but that's going to lead to lower performance. So there's trade-offs all the way through how you sort of design a system. In terms of what food waste or any kind of system might look like, there's obviously a whole different types of ways that can be configured. You can have user pays, you can have rates funded, you can have subscription type services, you can have single stream type services such as just food waste collections, like what we've been looking at. You can have mixed food and garden waste collections, which are also a lot of councils around the country are looking at as well, very common in places like Australia. You can provide a range of different types of containers, curbside containers, indoor kitchen containers, lined containers, or not. You can collect things at different frequencies. Weekly is kind of most common for curbside rubbish, but you can also have curbside fortnightly collections, or you can even do it more frequently, like they do in places in Europe, like Italy, where they collect food waste 2 to 3 times a week. And then lastly, the type of vehicle that you use can also affect things quite a lot. You might actually collect food waste alongside another material. So you might collect on the same truck and have a separate pod. So you only have to drive that truck down the street once. So there's pros and cons of all these types of configurations. In terms of processing, there's a whole lot of options, and I'm not going to go through them all. But the main ones that you'll be looking at, there's at least 4 facilities within reasonable proximity of Waipa District that you could send your food waste to, and they actually cover the range of the main sort of technologies that you might consider. So there's the most basic one is a sort of fairly low-tech approach, which is you just pile all the organic waste into a windrow, and you turn it and to keep it aerated. That's not so good for food waste, because food waste is quite dense and moist, and it can end up being that actually the middle of the pile becomes anaerobic, like you would get in a landfill, and that ends up smelling and releasing methane. So that's sort of not usually preferred for food waste. Vermicomposting is another option. There's a large site down in Tokoroa, outside of Tokoroa, that takes a lot of organic waste that's potential for the district. Also, there's one being set up in Matamata, and that basically uses special type of worms to essentially eat the food waste, and they create vermicast, which is a high quality product that you can use on soils to improve soils. And then there's another type of next sort of level up in terms of the technology involved is some type of in-vessel or forced aeration type process where you to keep the oxygen content up and stop it from going anaerobic, you can pump air through the pile, and you might cover it so you've got sort of better process control. You can stop the rain coming on and affecting your moisture content and all those things. So the more you go up the technology hierarchy, the more expensive the plant is. So you need more capital equipment. So it tends to cost a little bit more, but you get sort of potentially better product and better process control. Next one on the list there is anaerobic digestion. So that process is basically it's what happens in the landfill where you exclude the oxygen from the process. But what that does is it produces a gas, and if you build a plant especially for that, you can contain all of that gas, and you can actually use that gas to generate electricity or for heat. And actually, in fact, there's a plant being built in Reparoa by a company called EcoGas, which is going to take all of Auckland Council's food waste, and that will be they'll use that to heat the glass houses of Turners and Growers. I think we've got a glass house there, and so they'll use that instead of burning natural gas, essentially. So there's some potential kind of carbon savings there. The other one on the list there, which is there isn't a facility sort of in proximity. There was one sort of trial one outside of Tauranga. Is aerobic digestion, a little bit different process. We basically get enzymes to sort of speed up the process inside a container, similar to composting, but sort of a sped up version of it. So all of those different processes, they have different requirements in terms of the types of things that you can put in them. Like, for example, that the aerobic processes tend to need organic material like green waste or wood chips or whatever to get the right sort of balance in the process. Whereas something like anaerobic digest can just take food waste, doesn't need anything else to supplement it. All the processes will be sensitive to contamination. One of the troubles with collecting food waste from households is people tend to just chuck any old thing in there. They'll chuck bits of plastic or plastic bags, or there'd be old knives and forks, or so you can get quite a lot of contamination in the food, and that can be a problem when you get when it comes to trying to get a good compost product at the end that farmers and people want to actually buy. And the last sort of element there, just to quickly discuss, is there are sort of different options around the size of the facility, the location of the facility. I mentioned there's at least 4 facilities in sort of proximity here that we can potentially access. But there is also an option for building a local one. The disadvantage with sending things to one of those facilities is it's a bit far for the collection truck to take it to drop off. So you tend to have to bulk it and then ship it from there, which means another handling step, and plus the long distance transport, which is extra cost. So we did a little bit of looking at whether that's a local option, that a local kind of building a local plant would be an option. Could be an option. It would probably the money you save from sending it the extra distance would basically just about cover the extra cost of building a local facility, and so they're not having the same kind of economies of scale. So it's possibly 6 of one, half does the other. It depends on what kind of technology you choose, but that's probably a conversation for sort of further down the road. So just to sort of summarize that, so how you kind of collect in terms of the interactions, how you collect that material and the quality of the service that you have to the households has a big impact on the quality of material you get. Mentioned those bulking and processing infrastructure and markets. Also, the quality of your product will have an influence on if you can sell it or not, who wants to buy it. A lot of those operators will already have good markets in place and they'll have good quality control processes. For example, the waste management facility in Turahia that they sell to Dalton's, I think it is, and Tui compost, Bennett's and Tui. So yeah, and so they've got sort of good markets and stuff set up already, but they'll have good sort of quality control process in place. And then all of those elements can have a sort of impact on the viability. So integrating those services with other services. So if you've got neighbours that are sort of doing similar things, there might be opportunities for joint working and so forth as well. Looking at efficiencies and economies of scale. We haven't really looked at that in what we've been looking at to date, but that might be something. If you go to market, that might be something you choose to look at sort of further down the road. And so basically, to summarise that, when you're thinking about what service is going to be right for us, you need to look at the bigger picture and how it all those bits fit together. So to do that, when you look at all the different moving parts there are, it gets kind of overwhelming, and you can have infinite combinations of all of those different sort of moving parts. What we tend to do when we look at services and what you might want to do as far as the services go is we tend to develop what we call scenarios. So, and that's focused around, well, in this case, what's your kind of objective? What are you aiming to achieve through the service? And then you can kind of design a package of those different elements to meet that objective. So we did some workshopping with the senior management team and looked at what some of those options might actually look like for Waipa. And we came up with, through that process, we came up with 4 scenarios that we feel would sort of cover the range of things you might look at. And those ones are a low cost scenario. So trying to do the service that's going to drive costs down as much as possible. A high diversion scenario. So that's trying to capture as much of that food waste as you can and as good quality as you can and get the sort of best performance, not worrying so much about the cost element. And then there's another angle that we looked at was trying to maximise the carbon benefit through that process. As Lisa mentioned, there's one of the issues with collecting food waste is one of the drivers for collecting food waste is to try and reduce your carbon impacts. And so we looked at, well, what's the system design that's going to help us deliver the greatest kind of carbon benefit. And then the other service configuration that we discussed was just having an all-round sort of approach that basically combines the best of some sort of compromise between those 3 things. So before I kind of move on, is any questions about those scenarios that we've come up with? Have anything they want to add?
The question I had is the impact of contamination, really, because we're finding that in our recycling system, and I do wonder what, if that factor alone could actually stymie any of our sort of aspirations. Like, are you able to give us an assurance that the contamination issue with inappropriate stuff being included can actually be managed reasonably well without it's going to cost us quite a bit to try and audit to prevent that. So that would be a big concern of mine in this kind of system, which I generally am, pretty excited about the possibility of us actually being able to provide it. But yeah, I think it needs to be able to be controlled.
Yeah, no, very good question. And to be honest, it's one of the things that I think, because food waste collection services are relatively new in New Zealand, much more well established overseas, particularly UK and Europe. And contamination is an issue, not going to pretend that it's not an issue, but there are definitely ways and means of managing that. The best way to manage it is actually through if you're doing a food waste collection service only, a manual service at curbside. So you can basically lift the lid before you empty the bin, and you can actually see what's inside it. And then if there's any contamination visible, then you can stick in the bin, leave it behind, potentially if it's gross contamination. And that's very effective at quickly kind of educating the household. The households learn pretty quickly that actually, okay, I can't get away with that. but there are lots of other sort of tools in the toolbox in terms of education, in terms of running a contamination sort line at the processing plant, those sorts of things. So yes, it can be managed. It always comes at a cost. If you want to go low cost, you're going to probably get a lot of junk. But yeah, so I guess one of the things that we found is that when it comes to food waste collections, it's actually very easy to get it wrong. And if you just kind of try and do what you think you can get away with, it probably won't work very well. If you do it right, it can work very well. And that's the challenge, I think. But doing it right it's not the cheapest option. So to put that on the table. But did you want to say? Yeah.
So just to add to that, I think you can work to minimize issues with contamination through the way that you design your system, but the way that you implement your system is possibly almost more important. And I was involved in implementing a really large curbside food waste collection while I was based in the UK, and it was really successful. We had very few problems with contamination, and so far the systems that we've seen introduced in New Zealand, we haven't really seen anyone introduce the system in quite the way that we would ideally like to see it introduced. Hamilton is probably the one that came the closest, but it's all about, you have to do both, design your system right, but also educate consumers and keep that information going and explain the reasons behind what you're asking them to do. And I think that's going to be a really crucial part of food waste collections being successful. Yeah, that's a good point. So Sally just mentioned that one of the reasons why government is looking at standardising curbside collections across the country is so that we can have some national education campaigns, because currently one of the issues that holds us back from being able to do that at a national level is because recycling collections vary so much across the country. So the idea is that if a recycling collection and a food waste collection was done in pretty much the same way throughout the country, then there could be some national messaging which would be even more effective.
So just quickly on that, in terms of a national standardisation, when are we expecting an answer on when that's going to happen or not? Because there's no point in us designing a system and then have a new standard come out, which is either a greater or a lesser standard. So do we sit on our hands and wait?
No, absolutely not. It's a really good question though. So I think what we're likely to see come out from government, they've already given some pretty strong indications as to what they would see that standardised system look like, but their rules are more likely to be around what materials are accepted in the collection rather than how the collection system is actually delivered. So how the collection system would be delivered will vary around the country because we have varying access to different types of facilities around the country. And so you will want to do it slightly differently. I think their focus is going to be on having consistent materials, which is their goal with curbside recycling, so that the messaging can be around the types of materials that you can put into the collection and what you should be keeping out. So there are some questions to think about quite carefully with respect to providing liners or not. That's one of the key issues that government's looking at, but that's something that you can quite easily kick down the road a little bit until government has made a decision about it, and then you can decide exactly how you're going to deal with those finer details of implementation. We've been saying to councils that we're working with that, with government likely to introduce a requirement, then it's probably a good idea to try and get ahead of the ball rather than wait until government comes along and says, right, you've got to do it now. This is how you're going to do it. And bearing in mind that there's also funding that has been allocated for the implementation of curbside standardisation, including food waste. How large that funding pool may be, we don't really know, but it just kind of makes sense that you should try and get in there sooner rather than later.
Oh, Mike.
Yeah, thank you, Jim. Just what I couldn't see in here is who's the end user?
I think that's coming, isn't it, Duncan? We need to start talking about the scenarios for the product.
Yeah, in terms of the product from the process.
Yeah,
Yes.
I mean, I just watched a program the other day and the guy said a lot of businesses fail because they make a great product before they've got a buyer.
Yeah.
So he sort of inverted everything, which sort of made you think like, and I just pick up here on that private sector thing. I mean, if the end user's got an absolute need for this, then it's advantageous.
Yeah, no, fair question. And I did mention before about the larger established processes do have good end markets, and they won't. I mean, we've done quite a bit of work in the organic sector, and one of certainly through the stock take, one of the things that we found was that those processes that are successful and do well are the ones that actually start with the market and then build their product to meet the needs of the market. So that's what you'll find is that the market is still relatively immature, but it's definitely growing, and I think that will be something that comes through. I'd be reasonably confident that there will be good markets. The main issue is going to be the controlling the contamination through that process. But what I want to move on to talk about is just the scenarios, and what with each of these sort of 4 scenarios that we identified, what those kind of variables might include. So there's different things that you could include. For example, what types of material you put in there, whether it's just food waste only, or whether there's other things like food contaminated paper, maybe it's a small amount of sort of green waste, pet droppings, all that kind of stuff. So that when that a national guidance comes out, that standardization guidance comes out, that might be a good sort of place to start around determining that. Then the scenarios will vary around the types of containers. So I'll run through those types of containers in the next slide. But there's different types of containers you might choose to provide, which will have an impact on how people engage with the system. And then there's different ways that you can collect it. With food waste only collections, usually you'd have a manual collection service. Mentioned before about the possibility of inspecting the food waste before you tip it. That's a potential way to control contamination as well. The types of vehicles you choose. One of the things that the government has signalled that they might make funding available for in this context is actually electric vehicles for food waste collections. So that's a possibility. And the other area of funding would be the bins themselves. We'll talk about that a little bit more next time. And then obviously the options around the processing, whether you're in district, out of district, and those different types of processes you might use, and then what happens to the product at the end. So just digging down a little bit more in terms of what each of those services actually looks like and what the key kind of differences between them are. We've tried to keep it pretty simple, because if you vary too many things, then you're not sure what it is that you're actually that's driving the variation. So we've kind of ignored things like the type of food waste that you put in there, because that wouldn't have a significant impact unless you're looking sort of going a little bit off-piste with the types of things you might collect. So the low cost, so just going through those scenarios there. The low cost scenario basically just gives households a curbside collection container, sort of 23 to 25 litres. That's sort of probably about sort of that high, that wide. It's something that would be able to be manually collected, usually by a single operator in a vehicle. You would collect that weekly in this low cost scenario, and then we're saying that you would send it to a vermicomposting operation. Now, one of the reasons we chose vermicomposting, it is relatively low tech and relatively low cost compared to some of the other options. But also the operator we've spoken to has said that they would not want compostable liners as part of that process, because they'd consider that compostable liner to be a contaminant. Even though it's compostable, the vermicomposting process, the vermicomposting process is a low temperature process, and so it wouldn't break the compostable liner down. So you're not having liners in that low cost scenario, and so it would be you'd come up with an appropriate mix of material to go into a vermicomposting operation. The next one is the all-round one, and that basically what we've done there, it's very similar service, but we've added a food waste caddy for the kitchen, so householders get that kitchen caddy, benchtop caddy, which they can put their food waste in before they transfer it to the curbside one. And again, that would go to vermicomposting. Then in the max carbon reduction scenario, we add in compostable liners, and the work, certainly a lot of the work that we've been involved in overseas and in UK particularly, that's a big advantage to add a compostable liner in terms of the household experience. So the compostable liner, you provide it with a ventilated caddy, which has basically got holes in the sides and potentially holes on top as well, and that enables air to sort of circulate through the food waste, stop it going anaerobic, which we've talked about in your bin, which it can do. So it basically stops it from smelling, stops it from going all sort of slimy and disgusting, which is what householders tend to not like. So basically, when it stops all the things that will make householders not want to use the service. The reason householders don't like using the service is because it's smelly, it stinks, potentially flies and all that kind of stuff, and it's a bit gross for them to handle. So if you can kind of get rid of that element of it, makes it much more acceptable for householders to use.
Minimise the ick factor.
Yeah. So that's a sort of key kind of consumer element to which would help not just necessarily drive up the participation, make sure the participation doesn't fall off a cliff or sort of drop down, because everyone will probably try it once or for a week or two, and if it's disgusting, then they won't try it again. So you just find that the participation tends to hold much more steady when you have ventilated caddies and liners. Then we'd also specify an electric side load vehicle, and obviously that would save you your carbon emissions from road transport. And then that would go to an anaerobic digestion process. Now, the key thing about the anaerobic digestion process, we're assuming it would go to the Reparoa plant. They would have capacity. The disadvantage with that, it's quite a long way away. It's about 125 kilometres or so, depending where you are in the district. But so you do add a few road miles to it, but the carbon benefits of substituting out that natural gas with methane is actually quite significant, and it sort of bumps up the performance quite a lot in terms of carbon. And then the last one there is what we call the high diversion scenario. And so that's actually one thing to mention about AD. Although we've specified liners, the AD plant would consider them to be a contaminant as well, would actually remove them. They're sort of set up to do that, so it's not a problem as far as they're concerned, but it's a bit of you're using it just to improve the capture of the food waste, but you are chucking those liners out at the end of the day. So the high diversion scenario, same in-house, in-home sort of service as the max carbon reduction one. We've kind of gone out on a limb a little bit here for New Zealand. We're saying you do a twice weekly service, and this sort of given the gold-plated service, and this is very similar to what you would see in the likes of Italy, where they do 2 to 3 times a week. And I've sort of seen the collections in person. They do, and they have 80–90% participation rates. Very good service, works exceptionally well. And that's basically what you need to sort of get that really good participation. You minimise the yuck factor. You just make it super convenient for everybody. And that then we're saying that would go to an in-vessel process, which would be able to compost those liners successfully. So it will just would transfer through. So those are the scenarios. I just want to kind of finish off talking about the modelling process itself. So we've done dozens of, probably dozens of modelling exercises for sort of councils all around the country, and we've also worked with collection operators, helping them sort of to figure out how many trucks they need for their bits and so forth. And basically, what we do, there's a process that we go through in terms of developing the model. The first, and if you know anything about modelling, you'll know that what you get out of the model is only as good as what you put into it. And so the first thing that we do is we try and get as good data as we can on what's actually in the district that we're looking at, in the area we're looking at, and in terms of the numbers of households, their locations. So you've got a question?
No, sorry, Duncan, just to let you know, we're getting really squeezed for time.
Okay, well, this is our last slide.
So yeah, I also you are coming back in a week or so, aren't you?
Yes.
So yeah, if we miss any key points, maybe if we can save them for when you return as well.
Yep, sure. Yep. We'll get as good data as we can to make sure we understand as good as we can what's actually happening, the numbers of households, how much food waste is in the rubbish, where it comes from. And what we've done in this instance as well is we've looked at the recycling collection service that you've got, and we've modelled that to make sure that we understand the logistics of how the collections actually work within the area. We usually aim to get within sort of 5% of the costs for our modelling. We've got 1.2% in this instance. As long as we're within 5%, that's good. So we basically think we understand the logistics in the area pretty well, which gives us some confidence when we come to model the food waste collection service. That's essentially how we'll do a baseline like that, and then we'll run those scenarios on top of that baseline, and we'll come up with a range of outputs. Main thing we're sort of looking at is how many vehicles do you need, how many staff do you need, what's your sort of set out rates and your collection rates, how much food waste you might collect, what it's going to cost, and in this case, what the carbon benefits are likely to be. So that's what next time we'll come back with some outcomes from that exercise, and we'll run you through those, and hopefully that's all good.
So I think just the key feedback that we would like to get from you today, if beyond anything else, is just to check that you're happy with the direction of those 4 scenarios that we've come up with. That's the key question for you. So I guess maybe if we can just focus any feedback on those scenarios, because if we need to make any adjustments to them, fine-tuning them in some way, then we do have a very small opportunity to do that, but we really need to get some feedback on that today. As Duncan said, they have already been discussed with the senior management team and with the officers to identify those 4 scenarios that we have come up with.
Okay, so look, I think with the time constraints that we've got, we'll get that feedback to you, but probably not right now. We're going to have a break and then get back for another presentation at 1 o'clock. So look, thank you very much for coming along. This is going to generate a huge amount of discussion. So, and I think we probably could be here for the rest of the afternoon on this one. There's a lot of interest around the table. So I don't certainly want to sound like I'm cutting you off short, because it's an issue that we've all got to grapple with around the country, around the world probably. But look, a lot of interest. So we'll get that information fed back to you so you can